the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
I think this is the third time I read both of them, and I read them within the last couple of months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was, now and then I'm looking for I don't know, a romantic read, maybe, that's somewhat intellectually challenging, and now and then I'll pick up one of her books. And she's a curious figure to me because Ayn Rand had every reason to despise the Soviet Union and was a very good counter voice to their machinations. But, well, and I got introduced to her books. It was quite interesting. So I worked for the socialists when I was like 14 till I was 16 before I figured out that I didn't know enough to presume that the way I wanted to arrange the world in a utopian fashion was credible. And I figured that out by the time I was about 17. I thought, oh, well, what do you know? You don't have a job. I had little jobs, you don't have a business, you don't have a family, you don't have any education. It's like, what the hell do you know? Really? Right. So, okay, anyways, the person who gave me Ayn Rand's books was this woman, Sandy Notley. She was the mother of one of Alberta's recent premiers, a socialist premier, and she was the wife of the only elected socialist official in Alberta when I grew up. And I asked her what she gave me Solzhenitsyn and Huxley and Orwell. Like, she was an educated woman. And she gave me Ayn Rand's books, which I read when I was like 13. And, I found them compelling.
Yeah.
They've got that, they're romantic adventures fundamentally, with an intellectual bent. And I liked the anti-collective ethos that was embedded in them. And then I've read them, like I said, a couple of times since then. So here's the problem I have, and you can help me sort this out. Like, I certainly agree with you that a society that isn't predicated on something like recognition of the intrinsic and superordinate worth of the individual is doomed to catastrophe. Right. And so, but here's the rub as far as I'm concerned, and this is what I really had a problem with, especially this time when I went through Rand's books. It's like John Galt, for example, and Francisco d'Anconia, who's the architect?
Howard Rourke.
Rourke. Her heroic capitalists, essentially. They're not precisely heroic capitalists. They're heroic individualists who compete in the free market. Okay, and that's fine. And you can see the libertarian side of that. And I'm also a free market advocate, and partly because I think that distributed decision making is a much better computational model than centralized planning.
Right.
Obviously.
It's not obvious.
Right. Well, yeah, it should be.
Sure.
But it should be. It's not obvious to utopian Luciferian intellects, but it's obvious even if you just think about it from a computational perspective.
Well, I'll just say the smartest person is ignorant of 99.999% of knowledge.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's exactly it. Is that precisely why you want it distributed. Okay, so that's partly what I want to go into. So now the Randian heroes identify themselves as fervent individualists, and you stop me as soon as I get any of this wrong or in some way you don't disagree with. They're pursuing their own selfish ethos.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so that's the rub to me, because I'm going to think about this psychologically and neurophysiologically. So just to make it complicated. Okay, so the first question would be, well, what exactly do you mean by the individual and the self? Okay, so when a child develops, let's say, when a child first emerges into the world, they're essentially a system of somewhat disconnected primary instinctual sub-personalities, right? And so they, with the nascent possibility of a uniting ego, identity, personality, something like a continuity of memory across time. But that has to emerge. Now, it seems to emerge as a consequence of neurophysiological development and experiential maturation. And so, the child comes equipped into the world, say, with a sucking reflex, because its mouth and tongue are very wired up. So that's where the child is most conscious. That's why kids, when they can, put everything in their mouth, because they can feel it and investigate it far before they have control over their eyes or their arms, because their arms sort of float around. And so what happens is they're born as a set of somewhat independent systems. And then the independent systems, partly under the influence of social demand, integrate themselves.
Right.
Okay. Now, so, and then, like, by the time a child is 2, that child is still mostly disintegrated emotional systems. And so if you watch a 2-year-old, and I use 2 for a specific reason, what you see is that they cycle through basic motivational states. So a child is often like a child whose demand-oriented motivational states are satiated will play, right? And play and explore. But then they get tired and they'll cry, or they'll get hungry and they'll cry, or they'll get angry and they'll have a tantrum, or, or they'll burst into tears. Well, I said they'll cry, or they'll get anxious, right? And so they're cycling through these primary motivational states. Now, we understand that to some degree neurophysiologically, because the older the brain system, the more likely it is to be operative in infancy, right? So like the rage system, or the system that mediates anxiety, or the system that mediates pain, those come into being pretty early, but it's hard for them to get integrated. Okay, now here's the problem. And I don't know how to distinguish individualism from hedonism, and I don't know how to distinguish hedonism from possession by one of these lower order motivational states. So when Rand says we should be able to pursue our own selfish needs, she's kind of taking a classic.
She doesn't say selfish needs, she says self-interest.
Okay, so fine. Okay. So that, no. Well, no, I would say she moves between those two, because there are.
Never says needs, I'm positive.
Okay, she may never say needs.
She attacks that word all the time.
Okay, right, fair enough. Okay. So I'll back off on the need side. That was ill-chosen, and she makes absolutely bloody sure. Well, wait a second.
She says your needs are not a blank check on my.
I know. Yeah. But she doesn't. Does she say simultaneously that I have no right to pursue my needs?
She doesn't use that word. She says you pursue your self-interest to the best of your abilities.
Okay, but she also uses the word selfish.
Yes.
Okay. So fine.
In a very idiosyncratic way.
Right. Okay. Right. Absolutely. I would just want to make sure that we're proceeding on grounds that we both regard as appropriate. So the liberal types, the Scottish liberals, believe that if people were encouraged to pursue their self-interest, that would produce a self-regulating system. Now, Rand seems to accept that as a proposition. Yes?
Yes.
So if people are freely able to pursue their self-interest, then a system of free exchange will emerge out of that has the appropriate qualities of governance.
Yes, she says this explicitly on Donahue. She was asked, you're saying that if people pursue their own self-interest, there wouldn't be any oppression, there wouldn't be war, there wouldn't be any Hitler, because should they be less? And she goes, there wouldn't be any.
Yeah, well, look, when I'm negotiating with someone for a business deal, let's say, or, when I'm trying to formulate a strategy that enables me to work happily together with someone over the long run, I'm hoping that they'll be thrilled with the deal. Like, I'm not trying to win.
Of course.
I think, well, I would like to set you up in a situation so that you could pursue our mutual goals completely of your own accord. And then I don't even have to watch you, right? Because you're doing things for whatever reasons you have. But this is the thing. This is what I don't quite understand, is that self-interest. Okay, so it seems to me that for that self-interest to work, then it has to be a self-interest that's commensurate with the structure that would emerge if everyone was pursuing their self-interest simultaneously. You see what I mean?
Not everyone.
Well, okay. So let's say you and I make an arrangement, and it's a long-term arrangement, and at one point you decide that it's in your self-interest to violate that agreement because you can garner an intense short-term gain as a consequence.
But there's a long-term cost.
Okay, that's fine. Okay,
because I grow in this relationship, and also there's a long-term cost in terms of myself.
What's the cost?
The cost is I'm no longer a person of integrity. I'm not a man of my word. So Rand says, there's 2 Rand quotes where she says that man is a being of self-made soul. And she also says in The Fountainhead, which is about Howard Roark, the architect, that a building has integrity just like a man and just as seldom.
So you're seeing her self-interest as something that's nested inside a larger scale conceptualization of integrity.
Yes.
And then, okay.
So in fact, the whole point of The Fountainhead is she's contrasting these 2 types of selfishness. The first is Peter Keating, who's this basic striver, social climber, who has no internal self at all, no values other than what he sees around him. In fact, the working title of the Fountainhead was Secondhand Lives.
Yeah,
because
right.
Rand was working in Hollywood, and she asked the woman who she was working with, and there's just kind of this like pin drop moment where she's like, I'm looking in the face of the devil, where the woman goes, I'll tell you what I want. If someone has a cloth coat, I want a fur coat. If you have one car, I want two. If your house is 500 square feet, I want a 1,000 square
Right.
foot house. And Rand is like, oh my, she's like, this is evil. Someone
Right.
who has no self and whose values are strictly a function
Of
the
comparison.
values of those around her.
Right, but okay, but
hold
why
on,
is-
hold on.
Yep.
As opposed to Howard Rourke, who is selfish in the sense that he pursues his own goals and values in accordance with his moral code. And I think those are the two definitions of selfish. I know that.
Okay, so let's still fine. So let's still certainly Keating is portrayed in Rand as nothing but he's the kind of social climber who will do anything to gain comparative status
Yes.
in his profession.
But he will never be able to tell you why he wants the status. What is he going to do with it? It's kind of just in and of itself good, but he doesn't, has no value.
Well, okay, so that's the thing that's interesting to me, because I don't think that it's appropriate to presume that the mere search for social status is not self-interest. Now, I know you're making a more sophisticated argument than that, but I want to elaborate it completely. So I could say, I'm going to play devil's advocate against Rand, and for now, we can do that. Okay, so I would say, well, on what grounds are you criticizing Peter Keating's decision, self-interested decision, to prioritize status above all else? I mean, that's what he thinks is appropriate, apparently. And so on what grounds is that an inappropriate conclusion?
Well, I wouldn't even say that he thinks it. I think it's more that he's kind of taken this subconsciously from the ethos. He does not someone who thinks these things through. He just goes with what everyone else tells him.
Fine, I've got no objections to that.
Yeah.
I think that's how he's portrayed. But on what grounds do you believe that that's inappropriate? Because just because his self-interest doesn't match that of, and Peter Keating is an archetypal character in the Rand universe, right? I mean, he's duplicated in many other characters, like Ellsworth Toohey, for example, is like a meta Keating, essentially, although he's the spider behind the scenes who's orchestrating everything. But he claims to be selfless, but he's certainly pursuing comparative status like Keating is. But and there's a very powerful overt and covert implication in Rand that the path that Keating and Toohey takes is inappropriate, and the path that Rourke takes, or Francisco de Conia, and I'm probably mixing up the characters in the book at the moment, is the path of like true individual heroism.
Yes.
That's the romantic adventure part. But exactly the reason they're both self-interested.
They're not self-interested
Okay.
because Peter Keating doesn't have a self. There's no one there.
That's okay. Fine.
And
that was my mystery. So what does it mean for there to be something there? Right? Because so he's reduced himself to one dimension, which is social comparison. But that's not nothing. That's one dimension.
But it's nothing to him. It doesn't matter to him. It only matters to other people, so therefore it matters to him. This is not coming from, the call is not coming from inside the house. And this is where I would bring in Albert Camus. Because sometimes I give talks about networking. And one of the advice I give people, I say, if you know someone's in town for their birthday, right? I always take out that person for their birthday, and I do it for selfish reasons, right? And everyone laughs, and I go, the reason I do it is because don't you want to be the guy who takes people out for their birthday? He's awesome.
Right.
You could, what's it going to cost you? $25 in an hour?
Right.
So the whole point of the Camus kind of absurdism is that life is inherently meaningless, but this is a wonderful opportunity because you can be the kind of person that you want. And it's not necessarily that hard. It's just being consistent. So if you want to be someone who's high status, who no one who genuinely knows you likes or admires, knock yourself out.
Yeah.
At a certain point, the brain can only dilute itself.
It's counterproductive.
Or do you want to be the kind of person who, when faced with tough decisions, as I have in my life and as you have in your life, we're like, you know what? 20 years from now, I'm going to look back at this fork in the road and I'm going to chastise myself if I buckle and do the weak thing, even though it's going to cost me something in the medium term. These are two different paths that Rand portrays.
Okay.
And I think that's a very good moral code to live by.
Okay, so let me extract out some principles from that, and you tell me what you think. So one of the things that I proposed was that, a very young person, 2 years old, is still a relatively unintegrated conflict of internal dimensions, motivational dimensions. That's a good way of thinking about it. Okay, now we also hypothesize that the problem with Keating and Toohey, for example, is that they sacrifice to social status. So they become one-dimensional. And you portrayed it as a false dimension. And you said there's no self there. Okay, so here's a hypothesis about why it's false. Okay, and you tell me what you think about this. Okay, so imagine that there's a set of constraints that are implicit in the natural and the social world, such that if all these underlying motivational systems want to optimize their interrelationships, and they want to optimize their interrelationships in a social world, and they want to optimize their interrelationships across time, so it iterates, that a necessary pattern will emerge. Now, I think that's the pattern that your conscience calls you on when you deviate from, by the way. And I also think it's the pattern that makes things interesting to you in the world. So imagine that out of this internal conflict of spirits, that's a good way of thinking about it, there's a mode of integration, and that will satisfy all these internal systems in the optimal possible manner. And then there's an instinct that feeds that development, that calls to you by making things interesting to you, that would force you to develop in an integrated direction, or that emerges as conscience if you fail to do it. And that's not a unidimensional system of value. It's a multidimensional system of value, and it's a multidimensional iterable system of value that also works so that if you play that game and I play that game and we occupy the same territory, both of our games will improve, right? So it's not a zero sum. It's not a zero sum optimization. Okay, so then this is where I have maybe problems with the concept of anarchy per se. So let me tell you why. So does any of that seem inappropriate to you?
No, that seems fine. Rand's
Okay,
anarchist, of course.
That seems fine. Okay, so let me tell you why I have a harder time placing anarchy in that position.
Okay.
So I did this seminar on Exodus with a group of people, and one of the things we did was elaborate up a conceptualization that's derived from the Exodus story, that's the basis of Catholic social teaching, or much of it, as it turns out, called subsidiarity. And subsidiarity comes out of a particular story in the Exodus narrative. And so what you have in the narrative is the Israelites who have the habits of slaves. And so they're basically, you could think about them as a mass of Peter Keatings. They're only after short-term gratification, right? And so they have the habits of slaves. They've never planned, they've never integrated. You could say maybe the true self is absent. That might be another way of thinking about it. And so they try to make Moses into another Pharaoh, right, in the desert.
Right.
He sits as their judge, and he has to work out all their problems. Okay, so that's the scenario. This is happening while they're in the desert. Now, Moses' father-in-law, whose name is Jethro, comes along, and he says, you have to stop doing this. He says this to Moses. He says there's two reasons. Number one, if you take all that responsibility and power onto yourself, it'll kill you. Plus, you'll just set yourself up as another Pharaoh by taking all this responsibility that the Israelites are abdicating, and then you'll be back in the same situation you were in to begin with. And two, if you take away that decision-making power from the Israelites, then they'll just stay useless slaves forever.
Right.
Okay, so you can't do that.
Right.
And for two reasons. You don't get to be a tyrant, and they don't get to be slaves.
Right.
Okay. So then he proposes something very specific. As in consequence, he says, take all your tens of thousands of people and make them into a hierarchical society. And so get them to group themselves in groups of 10 voluntarily, right? So pick your 10 people. And then from amongst yourself in the 10, nominate the best of the 10. Okay, so now you've got your 10 people and leader. Now all the people are divided into 10s. Now take the leaders, put them in groups of 10, have them do the same thing. Do that all the way up to you, because you're the voice of God at the moment. And then if the Israelites have a dispute, they settle it. If they can't settle it by themselves, they settle it with their guy who's 1 in 10. And if he can't figure out how to do it, he goes to 1 in 100 and then 1 in 1,000. Now, so you have a social hierarchy in place, right? But it's a voluntary social hierarchy.
Right.
And every single level of the hierarchy has a requisite responsibility. And that makes a pyramidal structure that's the alternative to the tyrant and the slave. Okay, so now there's two ways you could conceptualize the individual. And this is where I have the problem with the anarchical viewpoint. I think that the identity that Rand is promoting is actually a reflection of the harmonious operation of that whole hierarchy. Like the whole thing, it can't be simply located at the level of the individual. Because if you're going to comport yourself in a harmonious manner, like we are in this conversation, like at the moment, I know you're not subjugating your individuality to the demands of the conversation,
right,
because then it wouldn't be a conversation, right? But you are bringing your...
I am subjugating to some extent. This is your show. I can't just talk about whatever I want.
Right. Well, but you're doing it voluntarily.
Yes, correct.
And you know the rules of the game.
Correct.
And you're doing it because you have your own reasons. So,
Correct.
So I wouldn't say, I don't think it's not so much subjugation as it is your choice to play the same game I'm playing.
Correct.
Okay, so this is
I'm
a
still deferring
hierarchy
to you.
of games.
Yes, it's still your show.
Right. Well, I set the frame
Yes,
for this
yes,
particular
correct,
interaction, right? And I would return the favor if you were hosting this.
Sure.
Right. But you're doing it voluntarily.
Correct.
But then, see, the thing about Rand, and this is the same thing, by the way, that's done by virtually every psychologist, just so you know it, is that Rand doesn't spend much time detailing out the necessary structure of the subsidiary hierarchy that would have to be produced to transform an emphasis on individual orientation into a complex and sophisticated society, right? And I don't think it's enough to say, if people were just pursuing their own enlightened self-interest, that society would automatically harmonize. Because you could also imagine that, okay, so that doesn't sit with you well.
It's not automatic at all. It's every group. Is Starbucks an automatic hierarchy? No, it's thousands of employees working together, and they create this international organization where if I go to the Starbucks in Washington, it's going to be the same as roughly as I go to the Starbucks in Paris, right? So these hierarchies do emerge voluntarily, but it's not automatic at all. It's just, if you're looking at it from the eagle's eye perspective, it's just these little dots. But when you get more granular perspective, it's infinite people choosing to work together to create this kind of superstructure. Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, so one of the
automatic
things,
it's not automatic at all.
Fine. Well, that's I'm perfectly happy to accept that, because I also don't think it's automatic. I think that those structures have to be set up
and maintained.
Yes, and in keeping with an ethos.
Yes,
and I think,
of course.
Okay. So
the point is, this is why culture is so important, and having this kind of promulgation of ideas and morals and values. Because if you just have people who are all very high time preference and just are not thinking past the next moment, you're not going to be able to build a society out of them unless you get rid of that first. Because if you're only thinking to the next 5 minutes, in this kind of like maybe someone who's been in prison all his life and don't have been trained not to think long term, it's going to be almost impossible to have any kind of working relationship, because he'd rather have that candy bar today than 2 candy bars tomorrow, because he knows he's not going to see tomorrow.
Okay. So you brought in the concept of time preference, which I think is absolutely appropriate. Well, yeah, because
crucial.
Why did you come to the conclusion that first of all, why don't you define time preference so everybody knows exactly what you're talking about? And then I want to know why you came to the conclusion that there's a reason that you brought the time preference discussion into this discussion. So maybe you could elaborate on what that is.
I always get them backwards. There's high time preference and low time preference. Point being, like we see this with kids in inner cities who they aren't sure they're going to ever see old age. The people they deal with are not trustworthy. So if they're offered, look, I'll give you either a candy bar today, or tomorrow, if you wait one day, you'll have 2 candy bars, they will overwhelmingly take the one today, burnt in hand, because the odds that the person is going to be there tomorrow or is trustworthy are quite low. And this extrapolates in a very nefarious way, because if you're living moment to moment, you're not going to school to plan for medical school. How long do you have to go to medical school if you're a doctor? It's years and years. You're just thinking just getting past tomorrow is a function also of poverty. When someone's worried about their next meal, it's very hard to maintain that vision of what am I going to be doing when I'm 40. Right. So that is that concept of time preference.
Okay. And so the problem,
extremely crucial.
Right. Well, okay. So
and this is also why having a stable society is important, and why governments are often a problem. take inflation. If I don't know how much a dollar is going to be worth 10 years from now, how am I going to make a contract with you that
Yeah,
you're
well,
gonna-
right. Well, you're also punished then for
Right.
foregoing gratification, right? That's one of
Right.
the terrible things about inflation is that you actually punish the people who are the conscientious people upon whose labor society would be properly
Imagine you
based.
tell me that, okay, in a year from now, you're going to deliver 10 yards of silk. But the definition of a yard today is 36 inches, but tomorrow it might be 3 inches. It's just like, or 50 inches.
Yeah.
I can't make any kind of plan if the definition of a yard changes.
Okay.
So if the definition of what a dollar changes year to year and it loses its value, you can't make long-term planning, because if you say I'm going to give you $1 million 10 years from now, I don't know what that means.
Right.
It could be absolutely worthless.
Right. Okay, so now back to this neurophysiological speculation. Okay, so
But
one
I'm
of
just
the
gonna make
things.
one more point.
Yeah.
Rand is very much, and this is where I very much part company with her,
Yeah.
very much a child of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
She has this Enlightenment delusion, in my opinion, that if a bunch of people sit down and they're given all the data and they hash it out, they're all going to come to the same conclusion.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I don't think that holds
She's
up.
an empiricist.
Yeah, I don't think that holds up
Doesn't.
at all.
No, but you're outlining the structure of the proper constraint through which that massive data would be interpreted. So
Yes, correct, yes.
Okay, so because once you bring time preference into it, you're starting to work in the domain that implicitly assumes that there is a higher order integration. So these initial systems, these initial motivational systems, they're very short term. So, and they want short-term gratification. So when a baby wails, when it cries, it wants to be satisfied now.
But can I say one thing?
Yeah.
This is the distinction Rand draws between hedonism and her philosophy, because she thinks that the more moral a person, the more long range his thought, whereas hedonism is very much pleasure of the moment. And I'm going to defend hedonism a little bit because the term gets a bad rap. Hedonism isn't Coke orgies. Hedonism is Martha Stewart, where you're having coffee and book club with your friends and having the pleasure of the.
That's more of an okay, but I would put you can actually separate those technically.
Sure, but the point is,
because that kind of hedonism would be more on the aesthetic end.
Sure,
right, and it's more
but
sophisticated.
But I'm talking about like
pleasure per se isn't bad.
Right, with this Epicurean idea of hedonism, how it was pitched, thousands of years ago, it wasn't at all this maximizing pleasure and
in the moment.
Life. Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, so we'll just define the kind of hedonism that we're objecting to as blinkered by the short term.
But I also hate this kind of WASP suspicion of hedonism, this pure tactical, like if you're having pleasure, you're doing something wrong. And it's like, pleasure is wonderful. People should do it more in the sense of, I'm reading a nice book, I'm enjoying a fire, I'm having a walk with my friends. These are all
everything in its place is the proper notion for that,
correct,
right? And so the demand for hedonic gratification shouldn't be put forward in a manner that sacrifices the overall integrity.
It's the reward.
Yeah.
I worked hard and now I get to watch a stupid TV show and not feel any guilt about it because I did my work for today.
Right. Well, and it's necessary.
And I have no shame about it.
Yeah. Well, the psychologists know, if they're wise, that you want to have all the forms of motivation that are available to you working to push you forward.
Yeah.
And certainly the draw. So technically, the source of reward that people work hardest for